Hi everybody, this is Bentley the Compost Guy Christie here again, and what you're looking at here is the very last of the material from my worm and vermicomposting system. This is actually the last video that I'll be creating in this overfeeding challenge video series, and the reason for that is that I've actually taken down the system and I've just sort of been having a look at what's been going on inside. Now, a big part of why I stopped using the worm in for now, I'm going to be setting it back up in the fall, but I took it down for now just because I am focusing a lot more on my outdoor activities and my outdoor worm bins, so I don't really want to take the time to take care of the system in my basement. And also the amount of waste that I've been putting into the worm in would be better put to use in some of my other systems. So that's sort of what I'm doing. But of course I did want to see what was going on inside the worm in, and also wanted to get some sense of the abundance of worms that we ended up with. And that is exactly what we have in front of us here. This is essentially, for the most part, the worm population concentrated down to the point of occupying essentially that portion of this sorting tray here. So I'm just going to continue to move this material slowly away. I'm not going to do anything fancy. I'm not going to weigh the worms, or certainly not going to count them. It's already taken quite a bit of time just to concentrate them down, but I just want to give people a sense of what we've been left with. Now, one thing you'll notice, not only are we concentrating worms, but there was quite a bit of a springtail population in this worm in, and you can see it'll appear like white flecks in the video, but there's quite a lot of springtails being concentrated here as well. And one of the things that really stood out for me when I was starting to take the materials out of the worm in, well, for starters, I was amazed at how well processed everything was. I was expecting to find everything down at the bottom pretty nicely processed, but as it turned out, much of what was in the system in general was very well processed. And what was interesting is that around the outer edges of the worm in, it was somewhat drier, and I noticed that there was a fair amount of material that hadn't been broken down nearly as much as essentially the central core of the system. So I thought that was rather interesting. And something else that really stood out in the material was the abundance of worm cocoons. There's an absolutely incredible number of cocoons in this material. And you can start to see some of the worms I'm getting down to there. And so it certainly turned out to be a pretty productive system. I originally, when I started up this particular worm in, all I did to stock it was add essentially material that looked like this, that had some smaller worms in it, not very many, and some worm cocoons in it, but I didn't add any specific quantity of worms. I was sort of curious to see how well the population would develop on its own, and it certainly did develop quite nicely. Yeah, so we're getting down here. If you push on that, I don't want to stress them out too much. I don't like to fiddle around with them too much, but really what it comes down to is just giving people an idea of the quantities of worms that were left in this system. Obviously this isn't every single worm. Some of the other material that I've separated off had worms in it, but I did my best to concentrate them as quickly as I could and still be left with a pretty good estimate of what the total quantity was. You can always tell when you're getting down close to pure worms, if you push it, it sort of bounces back. You can see a bit of movement down there. So this is, you can see here, just going to zoom in, essentially I'm getting down to the point where this is pure worm meat, essentially. So there's a good gob of worms in my hand right there, and that is just from this one little corner of this entire thing. So essentially it's the same sort of idea all the way across. You can just see the quantity of worms that are in there. These aren't huge worms by any means, so I can only imagine how many are in here. There'd be thousands for sure. This is another gob. Another gob there. Just essentially similar appearance all the way across here. They seem to be concentrated a lot at the back there, but I mean, there's another really good gob. You can see this is just absolutely loaded with worms. And when I first dumped out the contents of the worm in, I noticed that there was a lot of worms, but it's really interesting to see them concentrated down to this point. So yeah, that is quite a substantial quantity of red worms, and they are going to be taken and stocked into another system. I'm not 100% sure where I'm going to stock them yet. Probably one of my outdoor beds, so they will certainly do just fine. Again, I will be planning to set up my worm in once again once we get a little bit closer to the fall, and we'll get back into the worm in vermicomposting action again. I was pretty pleased with the way that my test turned out. This material is absolutely beautiful stuff. I need to screen it in order to get the really good worm compost out, but for the most part it's a lot of really beautiful compost. It's going to be put to good use out in my garden. So that's basically it. Thanks for tuning in to my Worm In Follow Along series. Once again, this is Bentley the Compost Guy Christie, and we'll see you again in another video soon.